Well, let me just start by saying that as part of the colonization of Palestine, from the 20s and the 30s, and then from 48 as state action as well, Israel has implemented mechanisms to prevent the economic development of Palestinians, to confiscate land, to prevent Palestinians from having positions and jobs within the Israeli economy as much as possible. And after the occupation of 67, then there was a decision that is widely documented and widely admitted by Israeli officials to prevent economic development in the occupied Palestinian territories of any kind of industry that could possibly come into competition with an Israeli industry. So it seems very natural that we will therefore think about putting economic pressure on Israel, because it seems to be the very same tool that Israel used against Palestinians. Not the only tool, of course. Israel also used a lot of violence, and we're now and a lot of means of repression and denial of basic human rights. But if we want to say we are justifying the use of economic pressure against Israel, we should also ask ourselves: is it useful? Is it can we hope that economic pressure would bring change, would bring real pressure on Israel? And if we say, but wait, this has already been tried before. There was the Arab boycott against Israel. The Arab boycott started in the 30s, actually, even before Israel was an official state. And this was only dismantled in the 90s, mostly as part of the after effect of the Oslo negotiations and the globalization. So the Arab countries boycotted Israel, and Israel continued to use repressive mechanisms. Israel was not deterred. So why should we think that we can succeed this time? And also we should remember the story of South Africa, of course. South Africa is a good example of a very powerful, widespread international boycott. Very few countries broke that boycott. One of the most famous ones was Israel, of course. The boycott of South Africa is widely seen by researchers today as not the most important aspect of the struggle of the ANC for liberation. And many people say that actually the boycott did not play a very significant role in toppling apartheid. There is a lot of debate about it, but we have to address that argument and see what we think about it and how we answer it. And moreover, the international community today is actually not only not boycotting Israel, but is actually funding Israel. And that goes especially to Europe, including Sweden, unfortunately, that is using aid to help the Palestinian economy under occupation, but within a system that is like using a carrot without using the stick. Meaning that the European Union and other countries as well, but the European Union is the largest player here, believe that by spending money on the Palestinian economy and paying for development, they could help create a viable Palestinian state. But without any kind of pressure to put on Israel on the other side, this aid does not fulfill its role. The standard of living of Palestinians under occupation has not gone up. In fact, it has gone down since the beginning of the Oslo negotiations. So aid has failed. And why is aid failing? Because Israel is destroying the projects. Israel is preventing them from taking off. And the European donors and other donors simply fail to make Israel accountable for that. And furthermore, Israel is profiting from the aid. Because the aid agencies, they buy their products from Israeli companies because of the Paris agreements that Hassan mentioned before. They buy, and they pay for all the services in Israeli currency. So if you look at it this way, if the Israeli economy is providing aid to the Palestinians, but the donors are paying for it, rather than Israel, who is responsible according to international law, what it actually means is that Israel is exporting to occupation. It's one of Israel's biggest exports. And the world is playing along with this. Nevertheless, I would try to argue that Israel is in fact vulnerable to the boycott movement, to BDS, and in fact that it can have a tremendous impact, because apart from all these mechanisms of repression used by Israel, and apart from the ways that Israel is able to exploit the Palestinian economy and even to exploit international aid to the Palestinians struggle against occupation. And the Palestinian struggle for freedom and equality has took a heavy price from the Israeli economy. And what Israel has done since the very first days of its existence is to use a lot of international assistance and to create a kind of militarized society and a militarized economy in order to keep this project of territorial expansion and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians alive. But there is a price to pay for this. A price that I think anyone who visits Israel will be able to see very clearly. And what we need to do is make people in Israel and also in the rest of the world realize that this price exists. Make this price visible for Israeli society. Let me start with a quick comparison between Israel and South Africa. Because when we talk about the faults of the boycott movement against South Africa, we have to address what were the actual characteristics of South Africa, what were the traits of that economy that enabled South Africa to withstand the boycott so successfully. And when compared to Israel, these economic conditions are different. Maybe Israel does not have the same traits, the same economic characteristics as South Africa. Well, first of all, an interesting piece of information is that 70% of all imports to Israel are raw materials. Because Israel, very much unlike South Africa, not like South Africa, is very poor in raw materials. Its economy is based on importing raw materials, processing them, and then exporting them. While in South Africa, they were able to use locally produced raw materials in order to circumvent the boycott and to meet local needs of the economy. So that's a very important point. In fact, it is often mentioned that if there was an oil boycott in Israel, a petrol boycott, because Israel doesn't have oil reserves, within 3 weeks the Israeli tanks cannot drive anymore. So this is the level of vulnerability in relation to importing raw materials. The second issue is how globalized the Israeli economy really is. Israel is in fact one of the most globalized economies in the world, very unlike South Africa at the time. Of course, South Africa, the apartheid was mostly before the days of globalization, and when globalization started to grow in the world, apartheid collapsed. But Israel is currently the 10th biggest importer, the 10th biggest importer in per capita terms in the world. Of course, per capita, Israel is very small. But there are only 9 countries in the world that import per person more than Israel. And it is the 8th biggest exporter per capita in the world. Only 7 countries in the world export more than Israel on a per capita basis. That doesn't mean that Israel is extremely rich. It means that Israel is extremely dependent on foreign trade. And that there are some very extremely rich people in Israel, a very small and powerful elite in Israel, and they are the ones who are important in exporting, and they are the ones who are feeding this economy. And another very important point is that Israel is very dependent on foreign currency. In fact, many Israeli economists like to joke that the biggest import into Israel since Israel was founded in 1948 was money. Israel imports money in the sense that it relies on aid from Jewish communities, aid from the United States since 1973, and compensations, mainly from Germany, for the Holocaust. These compensations, by the way, were given by Germany in order to compensate the Holocaust survivors that lived in Israel. But actually, the state of Israel stole the money from the Holocaust survivors and used it mostly to buy weapons from Germany. So that's a point worth remembering when we talk about this money and who should have really got it. But that's a side note. And finally, Israel is vulnerable because it is an extremely unequal country and suffers from deep poverty and deep inequality as a result of the internal discrimination and mechanisms of repression that Israel has adopted. The mistreatment of Palestinians doesn't stop in dividing Israel into two societies. Israel is also a very chauvinistic society that treats women very poorly compared to other countries in the West or in the developed world. Israel also treats poorly Jews that come from Arab countries, Jews of Arab descent, which are about half of the Jewish population. They are discriminated against within Israeli society. So Israel is a very stratified society with about 10 levels of citizenship, with different rights for every group, with Western originating male Jews at the top. Unfortunately, or unfortunately, I belong to this group. And then you have all these different groups under who are discriminated and mistreated and not allowed into certain jobs, not allowed to buy land and all of that, different kinds of discrimination. So that created a very stratified society. Israel is, in 1965 was considered one of the more equal countries in the world, actually. Well, despite the military government against the Palestinian citizens in Israel, it was ranked between Finland and the Netherlands in terms of income distribution. Today, Israel is the most unequal country in the developed world, with the sole exception of the United States. That's the only country more unequal than Israel in the developed world. But that is if you only consider Israeli citizens. If you talk about the Israeli economy, well, that's an economy of about 11 million people. You have to count the Palestinians who are part of the Israeli economy. And if you talk about them as well, and these 11 million people living under one currency, one government, one central bank, then you actually talk about the most unequal country in the world.